You're sitting with me tonight. 6 words, spoken low enough that only I could hear them, from the most powerful man in the entire ballroom. 30 seconds earlier, I had been on my knees in front of 400 guests, scrubbing spilled red wine off a marble floor while a man in a $5,000 suit told me I was, quote, the reason people like me shouldn't have to interact with people like you. My name is Maya Ellison, and I was 26 years old, wearing a rented black catering uniform 2 sizes too big, holding a tray of champagne flutes with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since the moment Victor Kane knocked a glass out of my grip and then, in front of the entire Sterling Industries annual gala, blamed me for his own carelessness. I had already started composing my resignation letter in my head. I had already accepted, the way you accept weather, that this was simply what my life looked like now, invisible until I made a mistake, and mocked the moment I did. Then a hand appeared in my peripheral vision, offering to help me up off that marble floor, and I looked up into the eyes of Adrian Sterling, the CEO whose name was on every banner in that ballroom, the man the entire evening had been organized to honor. What I didn't know yet, kneeling there with wine soaking through the knees of my uniform, was that the moment Adrian Sterling chose to defend a waitress in front of his entire board of directors would set off a chain of events that would expose a decade-old lie buried at the center of his own family's company, a lie that had already destroyed my family once and very nearly cost me my father's memory a second time. To understand how I ended up on that ballroom floor, you have to understand what my family lost 11 years earlier, on a construction site that had nothing to do with wine glasses or evening gowns. My father, Thomas Ellison, was a structural foreman. He worked construction sites across the region for nearly 20 years, the kind of steady, unglamorous work that built a modest but genuinely happy life for our family in a small 3-bedroom house outside the city. He wasn't rich, but he was respected, the man other foremen called when a site had a problem nobody else could solve, the man who taught me from the time I could hold a pencil how to read a blueprint and understand the invisible math holding a building together. I wanted to be an engineer because of him. I was 17, halfway through my junior year of high school, already accepted into a summer program for young women in structural engineering, when everything changed. My father was working a mid-rise commercial project downtown, a Sterling Industries development, when a section of scaffolding failed during a routine inspection. He fell nearly 30 feet. He survived, barely, with injuries that left him partially paralyzed and unable to work for the rest of his life. The official investigation, conducted by Sterling Industries' own internal safety team, concluded that the scaffolding failure was caused by improper assembly, a mistake attributed directly to my father's crew, and specifically, in the final report, to my father's own judgment as foreman.
He lost his job.
He lost his industry reputation, the 20 years of trust he'd built evaporating overnight, because no contractor wants to hire a foreman blamed for nearly killing himself through negligence. Our modest, happy life collapsed into something considerably harder, medical bills piling up faster than his disability payments could cover them, my mother picking up a second job, me quietly abandoning any plan that involved a 4-year engineering degree because someone needed to help keep our household running. My father never stopped insisting, quietly, without bitterness, that the report was wrong. The scaffolding hadn't failed because of assembly error, he said. It had failed because of a structural defect in the equipment itself, something Sterling Industries' own procurement team should have caught during routine inspection. Nobody believed him. Why would they? Sterling Industries was one of the most respected construction and development firms in the region, and my father was one injured foreman with a legal team he couldn't afford to fight. He died 4 years later, from complications that his doctors linked back to that fall, still insisting, in his last conversations with me, that somewhere in Sterling Industries' records was proof he'd never gotten the chance to find. I never expected, 9 years after his death, to be serving champagne at that same company's annual gala, in a ballroom decorated with Sterling Industries banners, working for a catering company because engineering school had become a dream I'd quietly buried alongside my father. I want to be honest about something because it matters for understanding everything that happened afterward. I didn't take that catering job because of some elaborate plan to investigate Sterling Industries from the inside. I took it because it paid better than my usual serving shifts, and because, at 26, working 2 jobs while slowly, painfully finishing an engineering degree through night classes, I needed every extra shift I could get. The gala was Sterling Industries' 50th anniversary celebration, an enormous event honoring the company's history and, more specifically, honoring its new CEO, Adrian Sterling, who had taken over the company 18 months earlier following his father's sudden death from a heart attack. I'd read about Adrian Sterling the way most people in the industry had, brief profiles in business journals describing him as unexpectedly reform-minded for someone who'd inherited an empire, someone pushing safety modernization initiatives that his own board reportedly found frustratingly expensive and unnecessarily cautious. I didn't think much about him beyond that. I had a tray of champagne to keep filled and 400 guests to serve, and my only real thought that evening was getting through an exhausting shift without dropping anything. Then, an hour into the reception, Victor Kane, Sterling Industries' longtime chief operating officer, reached for a glass off my tray at exactly the moment he turned to greet another guest, and the glass tipped, spilling red wine across the front of his white dress shirt and directly onto the hem of a woman's pale blue gown beside him. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt considerably longer. I apologized immediately, reaching for the napkins on my tray, already crouching to address the spill on the marble floor before it could spread further. Kane's face, red with wine and something considerably angrier, twisted into an expression I recognized instantly from years of serving events like this one. "Do you have any idea what this suit cost?" he said, loud enough that the surrounding cluster of guests turned to watch. This is exactly the problem with hiring cheap catering staff who can't manage basic coordination. I kept apologizing, kept dabbing at the floor, kept my eyes down the way I'd learned, over years of service jobs, was the fastest way to de-escalate an angry guest. It didn't work. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," Kane said, and something in his tone had shifted from irritated to genuinely cruel. "This is exactly why people like you end up doing this kind of work. You can't even hold a tray steady. Some of us actually built something with our lives instead of serving drinks to the people who did." The words landed exactly where they were designed to land, in the specific, tender place every service worker develops after years of being treated as invisible until they make a visible mistake, and then treated as worthless the moment they do. I don't fully remember what happened in the next several seconds, the specific mechanics of finishing cleaning that spill while Kane continued speaking over me to the small crowd that had gathered, narrating my incompetence like a professional insult delivered for an audience. What I remember is looking up, finally, kneeling on that marble floor with wine soaking into the knees of my uniform, and finding a hand extended toward me. Adrian Sterling was crouched down at my eye level, ignoring Kane entirely, his expression carrying a specific, quiet fury I would later learn was reserved for exactly this kind of moment, watching someone with power humiliate someone without it. "Let me help you up," he said, and his voice was gentle in a way that felt almost disorienting after Kane's tirade. I took his hand, more out of shock than anything else, and let him help me to my feet. He turned to Kane before I'd fully processed what was happening, his expression shifting instantly from gentle to something considerably colder. "Victor, you spilled that glass reaching across her tray while you were mid-conversation," Adrian said, his voice carrying clearly across the surrounding guests without needing to be raised. "I watched the entire thing happen. This young woman did nothing wrong, and I'd like you to apologize to her before we continue this evening." Kane's face went through several rapid transformations, confusion, indignation, and finally something that looked almost like panic, the specific panic of a powerful man realizing, in front of witnesses, that the story he'd just narrated publicly was about to be publicly corrected by someone even more powerful than himself. "Adrian, I hardly think." "I'm not asking you to think," Adrian said. "I'm asking you to apologize." Kane's apology, when it finally came, was clipped and clearly insincere, but it came, delivered through gritted teeth, while several nearby guests watched with a specific fascination people reserve for witnessing someone powerful get publicly corrected. Then Adrian turned to me, and the 6 words that would change the entire trajectory of my life left his mouth as quietly as if he were sharing a secret meant only for the two of us. "You're sitting with me tonight." I want to be clear that my first instinct was to refuse. Every professional instinct I'd developed over years of service work told me that accepting an invitation like that from the CEO whose gala I was working in front of his entire board of directors was a recipe for exactly the kind of gossip and scrutiny I couldn't afford. "That's really not necessary," I said quietly, glancing down at my ruined uniform. "I have a shift to finish." "Consider your shift finished with full pay," Adrian said, already signaling to someone near the catering staging area, a woman I recognized as the event coordinator, who nodded and approached to quietly confirm the arrangement. "I'd like you to sit with me for the rest of the evening. Not as an employee, as my guest." The event coordinator, to my surprise, seemed entirely unbothered by the request, murmuring something about having a spare place setting arranged at the head table within minutes, the specific fluid efficiency of an organization built around accommodating whatever its CEO wanted without question. I changed into a spare dress the coordinator produced from what I assumed was some kind of emergency wardrobe closet every large event apparently kept on hand, and found myself, 20 minutes later, sitting at the Sterling Industries head table in a borrowed cocktail dress, across from a CEO who had just publicly humiliated his own chief operating officer to defend a waitress he'd never met. "I owe you an explanation," Adrian said, once we were seated and the initial curious glances from nearby tables had settled into something closer to background noise. "I don't normally intervene like that in front of the entire board. But I've watched Victor treat service staff that way at 3 separate company events over the past year, and I've been waiting for a clean enough moment to correct it publicly. I'm sorry it happened to you specifically, but I'm not sorry it happened." I studied him for a long moment, trying to reconcile the careful, deliberate man in front of me with the brief, forgettable business profiles I'd half-read over the years. "You could have just fired him privately," I said. "Why do it in front of everyone?" Something flickered across Adrian's expression, consideration rather than defensiveness. "Because Victor Kane has spent 30 years believing his position insulates him from consequences," he said. "Private corrections don't change behavior in men like that. Public ones sometimes do." Our conversation that evening unfolded slowly, the particular unhurried quality of two people discovering, gradually, that they had considerably more to say to each other than either had expected walking into the night. Adrian asked about my life with the kind of specific, genuine curiosity I'd rarely encountered from anyone in his social position, questions that went beyond polite small talk into something that felt more like actual interest. I told him, cautiously at first, about the night classes I was taking toward my engineering degree, careful, initially, to leave out any mention of my father or the specific reason I delayed that degree for nearly a decade. "Structural engineering," Adrian said, something in his expression sharpening with interest. "What draws you to that specifically?" I hesitated, weighing how much of my actual history to share with a man whose company, whether he knew it or not, was directly responsible for the injury that had derailed my entire life plan. "My father worked construction," I said carefully. "He taught me to read blueprints before I could really understand algebra. I always loved the idea that buildings aren't just built, they're solved, like a puzzle where every piece has to hold weight correctly or the whole thing fails." "That's a beautiful way to describe it," Adrian said, and I could see him turning something over in his mind, some professional recognition sparking behind his eyes. "Sterling Industries has an internship program for engineering students, actually, though I'll admit our recruiting has focused almost entirely on traditional 4-year university tracks. We haven't done well reaching people finishing degrees through night programs while working full-time. Because people finishing degrees through night programs while working full-time usually don't have connections at companies like yours," I said, more bluntly than I'd intended. Adrian didn't flinch from the observation. "That's a structural problem worth fixing," he said simply. "Would you be interested in interviewing for our internship program?" "Not because of tonight. Because of what you clearly already understand about how buildings work." I felt something complicated rise in my chest, gratitude tangled uncomfortably with an old, unresolved anger I hadn't examined closely enough to name yet. "I need to think about it," I said, which was true, though not for the reasons Adrian probably assumed. I didn't sleep much that night, lying awake in my small apartment turning over the strange, disorienting evening, the specific vertigo of encountering genuine kindness from someone connected, however distantly, to the accident that had defined the worst years of my family's life. I pulled up everything I could find about Adrian Sterling online the next morning, reading through business profiles with considerably more attention than I'd given them years earlier when his father was still running the company. What emerged was a picture of a man who seemed, by every available account, genuinely different from the corporate culture he'd inherited, someone who'd spent his first 18 months as CEO pushing safety modernization initiatives that multiple industry publications described as unusually aggressive for a construction firm, initiatives his own board had reportedly resisted as unnecessarily expensive. I found myself wondering, with a specific, uncomfortable curiosity, whether Adrian Sterling actually knew the full story behind my father's accident, or whether, like most people in his position, he'd simply inherited a filed, closed investigation and never had reason to question its conclusions. I called the number Adrian's assistant had given me 2 days later, not entirely certain what I intended to say, and found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, accepting an interview for the internship program after all. What I told myself was that I needed the opportunity, that turning down a legitimate engineering internship out of complicated feelings about a company's history would be letting old grief make decisions that my actual career couldn't afford. What I didn't fully admit to myself yet was that some part of me wanted proximity to Sterling Industries' internal records, wanted, after 9 years, the chance to finally look for the proof my father had insisted, until his last conversation with me, still existed somewhere in the company's files. The internship began 3 weeks later, and I want to be honest that the first month unfolded with a kind of professional normalcy that almost let me forget the complicated history sitting underneath my presence there. I worked in the structural review division, cross-referencing safety compliance reports for active development projects, work that used exactly the skills I'd spent years building through night classes and made me feel, for the first time in nearly a decade, like the career I'd abandoned at 17 might still be reachable. Adrian and I saw each other occasionally, brief professional interactions in hallways and elevators that gradually, carefully, evolved into something warmer. He invited me to lunch during my 3rd week, ostensibly to discuss my progress in the internship program, though the conversation drifted, as it often did between us, into considerably more personal territory. I looked into Victor Kane's history with service staff after that gala. Adrian told me during that lunch, his expression carrying a specific frustration. Turns out there were 2 prior complaints filed by event staff over the past 2 years, both quietly settled through the events company rather than escalated to me directly. I've made it clear that won't happen again. Why does he still have his position if there's a pattern like that? I asked. Adrian was quiet for a moment, something complicated crossing his features. Victor was my father's closest business partner for nearly 25 years, he said carefully. He holds a significant equity stake in the company and considerable influence with the board. Removing him isn't as simple as it should be, professionally or politically. I filed that detail away, the specific weight of Victor Kane's 25-year partnership with Adrian's father, without fully understanding yet how directly it would eventually intersect with my own family's history. The discovery that changed everything happened almost by accident, for months into my internship, during a routine assignment reviewing archived safety compliance files for a digitization project the company had initiated as part of its modernization push. I was cross-referencing decade-old project files, converting paper records into the new digital compliance system, when I recognized an address that made my hands go still over the keyboard. The Downtown Commercial Development Project. The same project where my father's crew had been working 11 years earlier. I told myself, at first, that reviewing the file was simply part of my assigned work, that there was nothing unusual about an intern encountering an old project record during a routine digitization task. But once I'd opened it, once I saw my father's name listed as foreman on the incident report, I couldn't make myself close it and move to the next file the way professional discretion probably required. The official investigation report matched what I already knew: scaffolding failure attributed to improper crew assembly, foreman judgment cited as the primary contributing factor. But buried several pages deeper in the file, in a section clearly meant to remain internal and unreferenced in the final public conclusion, was a separate document, a procurement quality control memo dated 3 weeks before the accident, flagging a batch of scaffolding coupling components from a specific supplier as failing to meet load-bearing specifications during routine testing. The batch number in that quality control memo matched the equipment serial numbers listed in the accident site inventory. My father's crew hadn't assembled defective equipment incorrectly. They'd correctly assembled equipment that Sterling Industries' own procurement team had already identified as defective 3 weeks before my father fell 30 feet and lost the ability to walk without assistance for the rest of his life. I sat at my desk for a long time after finding that memo, feeling something that was considerably more complicated than vindication, a specific, nauseating mixture of grief for the 9 years my father had spent fighting a truth nobody would verify, and a slow, cold understanding of exactly how deliberately that truth had been buried. I want to explain something about the weeks that followed, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. I didn't immediately take the memo to Adrian. I sat with it, uncertain, for nearly 2 weeks, weighing an impossible set of considerations. If I brought this forward, I would be forcing Adrian to confront a decade-old cover-up implicating his own father, a man he'd lost only 18 months earlier, a man whose company he was still actively working to reform. I would also, inevitably, be revealing that I'd taken an internship at his company with at least some awareness of my family's history, a fact that could easily read as calculated rather than coincidental, regardless of how genuinely complicated my actual motivations had been. And there was Victor Kane to consider, 25 years of partnership with Adrian's father, holding equity and influence that made him considerably more dangerous to cross than an ordinary employee. If Kane had known about that memo, if he'd been involved in suppressing it, exposing the truth meant confronting a man who had already demonstrated, in front of 400 witnesses, exactly how cruel he could be when he felt threatened. I finally decided to bring the memo forward on a Thursday evening, nearly 3 weeks after finding it, sitting across from Adrian in his office after most of the building had emptied for the day, my hands considerably steadier than I expected them to be. "I need to tell you something," I said, sliding a printed copy of both documents across his desk. "And I need you to understand why I didn't say anything sooner." Adrian read through both documents slowly, his expression shifting through several stages I recognized from my own reaction weeks earlier: confusion, then dawning horror, then something that looked almost like physical pain. "This is the incident that injured your father," he said quietly, not quite a question. "Thomas Ellison," I said. "He was the foreman on that project. He spent 4 years after the accident insisting the equipment was defective, that his crew hadn't made an assembly error. Nobody believed him. He died still insisting it, still certain the proof existed somewhere in your company's records." Adrian set the documents down carefully, his hands, I noticed, not entirely steady either. "You knew this when you accepted the internship," he said, not accusatory, simply processing aloud. "I suspected there might be something to find," I said honestly. "I didn't know what specifically. I took the internship because I needed it professionally, genuinely. But I won't pretend some part of me wasn't hoping for exactly this." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents in front of him. "My father approved the final investigation conclusion," he said finally, his voice carrying a specific, complicated grief. "I need to understand whether he knew about this procurement memo when he signed off on blaming your father's crew." "I don't know," I said. "I only found what was in the file. I don't know who saw that memo before it was buried." What followed over the next several weeks was, by necessity, considerably more procedural than emotional, though the emotional weight never fully lifted from any of it. Adrian brought in outside legal counsel, specifically chosen from a firm with no prior relationship with Sterling Industries, to conduct an independent review of the original investigation alongside the newly discovered procurement records. The investigation confirmed what the buried memo suggested. The scaffolding coupling components used on my father's project had, in fact, been flagged by Sterling Industries' own quality control team 3 weeks before the accident, and internal email records, recovered through the legal team's forensic review, showed that Victor Kane had been directly copied on that quality control flag, along with a subsequent email exchange in which he'd explicitly instructed the procurement team to deploy the flagged batch anyway, citing project timeline pressure and the cost of sourcing a replacement supplier on short notice. When the accident occurred 3 weeks later, Kane had been the primary voice shaping the internal investigation's conclusion, steering the final report toward crew error specifically to avoid the liability and reputational damage that would have resulted from acknowledging a known equipment defect had been knowingly deployed. Adrian's father, the forensic review determined, had signed off on the final report without full knowledge of the buried procurement memo, trusting Kane's characterization of the investigation's findings, a specific, painful detail that let Adrian grieve his father without also having to reconcile him as a deliberate architect of the cover-up, even as it left him confronting exactly how thoroughly Kane had manipulated that trust for over a decade. He let my father die still fighting for a truth that was sitting in our own company's files the entire time, I told Adrian, the day the full forensic review was finalized, feeling something that was equal parts vindication and a grief so old it had calcified into something almost unrecognizable as sadness anymore. 9 years, Adrian. 9 years of people looking at him like he was making excuses for his own carelessness. I know, Adrian said quietly, and I understand that nothing I do now fully repairs that. But I need you to know what I intend to do regardless. What Adrian did over the following month unfolded with a specific, deliberate thoroughness that told me, more clearly than any private apology could have, exactly how seriously he was taking the situation. Victor Kane was removed from his position as Chief Operating Officer, a process that required considerable maneuvering given his equity stake and board influence, but Adrian, armed with forensic evidence of Kane's direct role in knowingly deploying defective equipment and subsequently steering the investigation's false conclusion, secured unanimous board support for the termination once the full findings were presented in a closed session. Kane's equity stake remained his legal property, but his influence within the company, built over 25 years, evaporated within a single afternoon. Sterling Industries publicly reversed the original investigation's conclusion, issuing a formal statement acknowledging that the accident had resulted from a known equipment defect rather than crew error, a statement that specifically and by name cleared my father of the negligence finding that had followed him for the rest of his life and, in a sense, followed my family for 9 years afterward. The company established a settlement fund for my family, calculated based on what my father's disability compensation and lost earning potential should have reflected had the original investigation been conducted honestly, a considerable sum that, while it couldn't undo 9 years of financial hardship or bring my father back, meant my mother could finally retire from the second job she'd worked since the accident, and meant I could finish my engineering degree without simultaneously working 2 jobs to cover the cost. And Adrian did one more thing, something he didn't discuss with me in advance, something I discovered only when he invited me to a considerably smaller, quieter event than that 50th anniversary gala, a modest ceremony held at the downtown site where the accident had occurred, now fully redeveloped, unveiling a permanent safety memorial plaque bearing my father's name alongside a formally corrected account of what had actually happened that day. Thomas Ellison, the plaque read, Foreman, whose integrity and insistence on truth, though initially disregarded, ultimately led to lasting safety reforms at this company. His legacy is honored here. I cried reading it, standing beside my mother in the cold autumn air, 9 years of grief and vindication arriving at once in a way that felt, for the first time since I was 17 years old, like something approaching closure. I want to be honest about the relationship that developed between Adrian and me during those months, because I think it matters to acknowledge how complicated it was to build something genuine on top of such a fraught professional history. We were careful with each other, deliberately so, both of us aware of how easily our growing feelings could be read by outside observers or even by ourselves as tangled up with guilt, obligation, or gratitude rather than something built on its own foundation. Adrian, to his credit, never once used the internship, the investigation, or the eventual settlement as leverage for anything personal between us, and I found myself, gradually, trusting that distinction in a way I hadn't expected to trust anyone connected to Sterling Industries ever again. What actually built our relationship, underneath all of that complicated history, was considerably simpler. Long conversations after work about engineering problems that genuinely interested both of us. His willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths about his own family's company rather than deflecting them. The specific, steady way he treated everyone around him, from board members to catering staff, with exactly the same baseline respect, a quality I'd noticed the very first night we met, kneeling on that marble floor, and had watched hold consistent through every subsequent month. "I need to ask you something," Adrian said, nearly a year after that first gala, sitting across from me at a considerably quieter dinner than any of our earlier meals together. "And I need you to answer honestly, because I've spent enough of my life around people who tell me what they think I want to hear." "Ask me," I said. "Do you think you could have built feelings for me if none of this had happened?" he asked. "If I'd simply been some ordinary man you met at a restaurant, with no company, no investigation, no complicated history connecting our families?" I thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved to be thought about, before answering. "I think what actually drew me to you," I said slowly, "wasn't the company or the money, or even the justice you eventually helped bring my father. It was watching you choose, over and over, to do the harder, more uncomfortable right thing, when the easier option was sitting right there available to you. I think I'd have fallen for that in a restaurant with no company attached to your name at all." Adrian's answering smile was the kind I'd come to recognize as entirely, unguardedly genuine, the specific expression he reserved for moments that mattered most. I finished my engineering degree 8 months later, no longer working 2 jobs simultaneously, finally able to focus fully on the coursework that had taken nearly a decade longer than it should have because of an accident that was never actually my father's fault. Sterling Industries offered me a full-time position in the structural review division upon graduation, an offer I accepted only after insisting, and Adrian agreeing without hesitation, on a formal recruitment process handled entirely by human resources rather than any direct involvement from him, a distinction that mattered considerably to both of us, as we navigated building a genuine partnership rather than something that could ever be mistaken, by others or by ourselves, for favoritism. I threw myself into the work with a specific, personal intensity that surprised even my supervisors, developing enhanced procurement verification protocols specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of quality control failure that had injured my father, protocols that Sterling Industries eventually adopted company-wide, and that, within 2 years, several other firms in the industry began adapting for their own safety systems. Adrian proposed 18 months after that first gala, at the same downtown site where my father's memorial plaque stood, on a quiet evening after the construction crews had gone home for the day. "I've thought a great deal about where to do this," he said, kneeling in the same spot where we'd unveiled that plaque nearly a year earlier. "And I kept coming back to this place, not because of the history it represents, but because everything I understand about you, your integrity, your patience, the way you insist on truth even when it costs you something, all of it makes sense standing here, at the place where your father's truth finally caught up to the world." I said yes, with considerably more certainty than I'd felt about almost any other decision in my adult life, standing at that site with my father's corrected legacy carved into permanent stone beside us, feeling, for the first time in nearly a decade, like the future ahead of me had space in it for genuine, uncomplicated happiness. We married the following spring, a small ceremony that included, among the guests, several of my father's former co-workers, men who had known him for 20 years and had watched, alongside my family, as his reputation was quietly restored after 9 years of unjust doubt. My mother walked me partway down the aisle before Adrian's mother, in a gesture that had become a quiet tradition between our 2 families over the preceding year, joined to complete the walk alongside her, a small, deliberate symbol of 2 families brought together by tragedy eventually choosing, together, to build something considerably better on top of it. Victor Kane, we later learned, faced separate civil litigation from several other former employees whose safety complaints against him had also been buried over the years, a slow, ongoing reckoning that Adrian ensured Sterling Industries fully cooperated with rather than quietly settling to avoid embarrassment, the specific, sustained integrity that had defined every choice he'd made since that first night in the ballroom. I think about that night often, the specific humiliation of kneeling on marble floor, scrubbing spilled wine while a powerful man narrated my worthlessness to a room full of strangers. I think about how easily that evening could have simply ended there, one more forgettable indignity in a long string of service industry humiliations I'd learned, over years, to simply absorb and move past. Instead, 6 quiet words changed the entire trajectory of my life. Not because a CEO chose to be kind to a waitress, though that mattered enormously in the moment, but because that small act of decency opened a door that eventually led to truth, to justice 9 years overdue, and to a partnership built on exactly the kind of integrity my father had spent his whole life, and the years after his accident, insisting mattered more than anything else. People sometimes ask me, when they learn the full story, whether I regret the years I spent grieving a father whose reputation the world had wrongly stained, whether all that unresolved anger feels, in hindsight, like wasted time given how everything eventually resolved. I don't think of it that way. I regret that my father died before he saw his name cleared. I regret 9 years of my mother working exhausting double shifts to cover expenses that should never have fallen on our family in the first place. I regret every moment I spent as a teenager and young adult absorbing the quiet, unspoken judgment of people who assumed my father's negligence had ruined our family's stability when the truth had been sitting, buried, in a filing cabinet the entire time. But I do not regret the specific, complicated path that eventually led to the truth surfacing, because I understand now that some forms of justice arrive slowly, unpredictably, through channels nobody could have planned or anticipated. Sometimes it takes a spilled glass of wine, a moment of public cruelty, and one person's decision to respond with decency instead of indifference, to set in motion exactly the kind of reckoning that 9 years of quiet grief alone could never have achieved. My father always told me that buildings don't fail randomly. Every collapse has a specific, traceable cause, some flaw in the foundation or the materials or the assembly that, if you look closely enough, eventually reveals itself. I think, in a way, the truth about his accident followed that same principle. It was always there, buried in the foundation of a story built on convenient lies, waiting for someone patient enough and brave enough to finally look closely enough to find it.